Welcome to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to be with Flora Baker today. Flora is a travel writer and the author of the Adult Orphan Club. Thank you very, very much for joining me today, Flora.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yay! And I discovered Flora's book through searching, and I was like, wow, the Adult Orphan Club. Obviously, we share this story of losing our parents before the age of 30. And I bought the book and read it, and I was like, wow, this is such an amazing book. And I was so delighted when we connected and you agreed to doing this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we're going to start with the first question, which, what is your definition of grief?
It's a biggie. I think ultimately it's the thing is, there are so many tropes for this. There's the whole like grief is love with nowhere to go, and grief is the opposite of how much you loved them and all this stuff. I think for me it's a really obvious absence of something that you used to have, and I don't think there's anything comparable. That's what's so complicated with it. Like, it's not an emotion that's replicated in any other sphere of emotion. And it's one of those ones that people really do seem to kind of want to fix, because it's human nature. It's like inherent that you want to fix stuff, and grief is, I think, the only one that you can't, which is very difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's a big question.
It is a really big question, but I think that's so true about the wanting to fix it. And then, of course, people say all the things to try and fix it, which are just, not so helpful. Yeah, because in a lot of therapy, you're always sort of going back to the past and figuring out certain patterns and trying to ascertain where the root cause is. But grief, it seems that it's much more sort of unexamined and really not misunderstood. And it's quite interesting that, because it really is kind of the root cause of so much pain, and we live in this really pain avoidant culture and society. So the idea that we just want to sort of run away from it and push it down feels like the easiest solution until we can't.
Completely. And I think also it's a very kind of, you're on one side or the other situation. As we both know from losing parents early, like, it's, people will try and empathize, but you can know very quickly if they actually can empathize or not. So until you've had like a major, and the thing is as well, like, it doesn't have to be like, an immediate family member or like your partner or something. Like, it can also be someone who you just have a really close bond to. But I think fundamentally it's like, when you do lose that person, you kind of step over a line, and then you have, I mean, the kind of the flip side of it is you do have this immediate bond with a lot of people who've been through the same thing. It just sucks that that's the reason that you find out that you have a bond.
Yeah, it's like the club that you don't really want to be part of, but
much, yeah,
that you do understand people so much more if you've been through it. And your book, your brilliant book really does walk the reader through the experience, and you obviously relate that to your own feelings of losing both of your parents, and it offers a lot of very practical and grounding advice, when we're not taught a lot of these things of how to handle this situation of when somebody dies, and the paperwork that goes with it, the sorting through all of the things. There's so many facets to deal with. And a lot of people might say, oh, well, this book's not really relevant for me. And because, like I said before, we lost both our parents before we were 30, as the sort of adult orphans, if you like. But actually, it's super relevant, because you might be the adult orphan when you're in your 70s. And so it's really relevant for all ages. And I really enjoyed reading your experience of grieving, your mum died first, and then later on your dad. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of grief after each parent and how that was different, how that was similar.
Well, my mum passed away very suddenly. Well, relatively suddenly. She had cancer when I was 10, and recovered from it. Had a mastectomy, radiotherapy, all that stuff, but I didn't really know much about it because I was still quite little. But then it came back again, just shy of my 21st birthday. And it just happened really quickly. Like, she went into hospital, they realized what it was, and then within like a week or two, I think they said that she was terminal, and then she died. So it all kind of happened in about a 2-week period, and I wasn't expecting it, had no comprehension of what that loss could even feel like, and it wasn't on my radar at all. And I was 21 pretty much, and was about to go on, I was at university, was about to go on a year abroad to study in San Francisco for a year. And I was on like a kind of precipice of adulthood kind of thing. And I just was like, nope, not grieving, not doing that. That sounds terrifying. It's too much. And I think because I had a quite clearly definable line again of going across the country, going across the world, and essentially starting over, albeit for a year, I was still kind of starting a very significantly new stage of my life. And also I wasn't around anyone who knew what had happened. So I think I went to America 8 months after she died, which is still very fresh, but obviously I didn't know if that was fresh or not. I think I'd assumed that I'd got through it for me. But yeah, so I think after she died, I really just didn't let it in, didn't let the feelings in, really. I bottled them up and didn't really talk about it to anybody. That then went badly wrong because I was then just crying in inopportune moments, like walking down the street, just suddenly sobbing, but having really no idea what to do with that emotion. Like, there wasn't really there wasn't a guidebook, but this was in 2009. So there really wasn't much literature that was easily accessible or easily obvious to me. Social media wasn't really a thing. I didn't have anyone in my community who'd gone through a loss like that, and I was still a kid, really. So it just wasn't something that I knew how to handle. And it probably took about maybe 6 years to really start digging into it, because I pretty much had a breakdown and then was like, oh, this is the grief thing that I didn't do. Okay. And I started going to therapy, which was a fantastic choice, even though my therapist wasn't the best. But I think about 8 months into that therapist, my dad got ill, which was in 2017. And that was a very different decline. It was a very much longer process, but it was clear he was going to die. So I had a lot more time to prepare for it, really, but I wasn't really prepared for how the grief was going to hit, because it was just a very different beast. And I feel very sorry for my old self, because I remember thinking, as I'm sure many people do if they've lost both parents or lost like two equally poignant losses, poignant people, I remember thinking like, well, at least I know how to do this. At least I've done it before. At least I understand a parent dying, like I've got this. I've got one up on the grief. And that was not true. And after my dad's death, that was the worst period of my life by far. It was like you have that one loss and you do think you're somewhat untouchable, and you think that nothing else can possibly be as bad as that. So you've kind of, again, you've got a handle on it all because you've had the worst. But then if that worst gets doubled, it's just like, I couldn't handle it. So that second time round was 100% worse. But weirdly, I think because I understood that confronting it was the only real thing I could do, I pretty much went in all guns blazing and kind of essentially was like, okay, have at it, like do what you're going to do. And the positive upside of it was my mum's grief was like bubbling under the surface for about 6 years before I started dealing with it properly. My dad's, the related grief to my dad was 1 year of hell But then after that year, it kind of reduced so drastically that, like, obviously I miss him like crazy, but it's not the same at all. And yeah, it's really long but low level, or like really short but awful, I think, were my two my two experiences.
Yeah, a really good example. And you talked about in the book that you created a support group as your dad was getting unwell. You sort of got your friends together and you were like, okay, I'm going to need this group to tell them how I feel. And could you talk a little bit about that, and whether there was any other support groups that, if you did join those, or if you continued with that therapist or find a new one, or any extra support that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lovely close circle of friends. They're all kind of like individual friendships, and so they don't all hang out together. So I basically made them. I put them all in a WhatsApp group and was like, I need to be able to know that there's going to be somebody who I can say something to. So if I send the same thing to 6 different messages, that's going to be a bit more stressful. Whereas if I just send the one thing to like the 6 or 7 close people in this one group, and that was really helpful. I mean, I'm not going to lie, like, you always feel alone during this. However close your people are, they're not going through what you're going through. So there's always going to be that level. And I do remember some awful times when just nobody picked up because it was just the wrong time, you know, and I was having an awful situation, moment, whatever it was. And I remember going through my close list and phoning every person and nobody picked up. And it's just so hard. But the difference is that knowing that they are there, and it's not about them not caring about you. It's just that, you know, situationally or logistically, it just doesn't work. But yeah, that was very helpful most of the time. And then since my dad's death, I stopped going to a therapist I was seeing prior to his death, and I found another one who was actually fantastic. And we met together for a year, and that was very helpful. But I've forgotten the last thing you asked me.
Did you join any grief support groups, or was that enough?
Well, to be honest, I've found that the kind of organically growing ones are the best for me. I went to a few sessions because both my parents went to the same hospice a decade apart. They both died at the hospice. And as hospices are wont to do, they offered a 6-month grief support system meetup kind of thing.
Yeah.
6 months after my dad died. I didn't know any of this after mum, because I think my dad was a very private person, and I think he rebuffed that but didn't tell me about the opportunity, so I really wasn't aware that I could have gone to a session like that. But yeah, after his death I went to this like 6-month meetup, and it was not good. That was not helpful for me at all, because there were so many people who were utterly devastated by the loss they'd had, all sitting around in a room, all total strangers, and also all in the building where their loved one had either been a lot of the time or had died in. It was too much. And I remember at the time thinking, how can I feel so like isolated in all this emotion, but even when I'm with a group of people who are in the same scenario as me, that actually makes me feel worse. Like, that was it was a lot. But weirdly, I mean, I think just by dint of writing about grief online a lot, I now do have a large grief network. And I have a WhatsApp group of about 80 orphans.
Oh, man.
It's amazing. It started on Twitter. There's a wonderful podcast called The Grief Cast, run by Cariad Lloyd, and she often helps connect different people who are grieving. So someone will tweet asking for help with something, and she'll put a shout out essentially. And she had tweeted from someone, she'd shared a tweet from someone talking about orphanhood. And a few of us replied, enough so that one woman said, well, should we just start a WhatsApp group for people who've lost their parents, both parents? So that's been running for a year, and we message all the time, and there's always new people coming in. And I can't imagine having had that at the initial grief stage. And I'm just really glad that there's a lot of other people now who can have that resource, because it's so helpful.
So helpful. And like you were saying, with social media that wasn't really there back in 2009. Yeah. And now there's so much that's helpful, you know, on Instagram, and that it's quite incredible actually, the support that's out there, and people who are really opening up, really talking about the topic of grief. It's amazing. It's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's changed a lot. It really has. Just going back to your parents, did you think, you know, obviously your dad got unwell. Did you think like, oh, he can't possibly die? You know, this would be so unfair. Or were you quite like, oh, this is actually happening? I just wondered what the level of denial was in your case.
Oh, the denial. God. It's actually quite weird. Throughout the time between them dying, I honestly never considered that he'd die, which is just so weird, because I just feel how it's so strange how many versions of yourself you can trace throughout a grief journey, as it were. Like it's extraordinary, because before my parents died, it was one of my biggest anxieties. When I was younger, I was really scared that I'd go to sleep and I'd wake up hearing the fact that one of them had died, like hearing one of them screaming about the other one being dead, which isn't exactly how it happened, but it, you know, did still happen. But I think when mum died, that definitely felt like a one-off. It felt like that was the big thing that was going to happen to me, and like nothing else could really be bad.
Yeah.
And there was one memorable time when dad got, I think he got the flu, but was like completely decimated by it. And I remember thinking then, like, but he can't die. I mean, that's just not possible. And I say this, my dad was 79 when he died. My parents were, I think, 42 and 50 when they had me. Like they were late parents. And it was very understandable that my dad would get ill and die at some point, but I hadn't really entertained the idea until he started to get ill. And then I suddenly realized, and it was pretty much a 180. I remember thinking very early on, probably from a self-preservation standpoint, I immediately was like, it's happening now. It's going to be very, very soon, or now, and I need to be ready. And a lovely friend of mine, I remember driving around with her, and she was saying, maybe he'll get better. Maybe he'll be fine.
Yeah.
Oh no, love, no. Sorry, but just that's not helpful actually, because it's not the case, and he is going to die, and I'm going to have to handle it. And I think it's it's a survivalist thing, really. I knew how tough the first time round had been, and I think my kind of internal processing was, the quicker you establish that this is real and it is happening, the not easier, but like the more manageable the processing of this will start being, because being in denial when it's happening for the second time, just way too hard, I think, for me.
Yeah, I see your, you know, practical side of, you know, how you've written the book as well comes through in that. Like it's a wise thing to do to prepare yourself.
I guess so. Although that said, like I mean, it wasn't wise.
Never be prepared.
Like, I think that this is something that really stresses me out sometimes, is that people will definitely kind of praise you for the way that you handled it, and it's like, it wasn't a decision though. Like it wasn't. I didn't decide to not be in denial. It's just that my active anxiety, to be honest, I mean, I'm a very anxious person. I think my anxiety was like, prepare, get going, move, because that was, you know, that was trying to get as much of a jump on it as I possibly could, which of course actually isn't really anything. It doesn't help at all.
They're all ways of surviving, aren't they? Sort of survival tactics, and we'll choose our own weapons, if you like, to try and survive.
And it is a big power of anxious people, to be fair.
Yeah.
Being very survivalist.
Yeah, and I always have that sort of like yesterday, my sister was picking me up from the station, and then she was late, and my anxiety will immediately go to, she's had a car accident, you know, she's dead, oh my god. Like I that's just the way my brain has been, because of, you know, having traumatic events like that happen early in life. And that's the sort of anxiety that big grief or trauma leaves us with, I think, just going to the worst case scenario. I'd always think, well, if I can get over if I think up the worst case scenario in my mind and I've figured it out in my mind, then if it happens, it's not going to be as bad. That sort of survival one. But you're an only child. So when you were younger, it's very interesting that you were having that anxiety about your parents.
Yeah.
And did you often think when you were younger, I wish I had a brother and sister, or when you were going through everything, it must have felt a lot to have to cope with all of the, or everything that you have to deal with after somebody dies.
I mean, yeah, I definitely wanted siblings when I was younger. I always kind of half imagined having like a big older brother who was, you know, all nice and brotherly.
Yeah.
But I think it's yeah, I mean, I think there's positives and negatives, aren't there? I one of my mum's close friends who lives in the States now, or has always lived in the States, she told me stories about how difficult sibling rivalry stuff had been after parents died, because yeah, contesting wills, contesting, you know, legacy, like all this stuff. And I think I was very, I'm hesitant to say the word lucky, because I don't think any of this is definable as lucky, but it was a situation that worked for the way I am as a person, because I tend to be pretty introverted, particularly with this stuff. Like, processing all these emotions is hard enough by yourself, let alone having to explain them to other people at the time. Though I love talking about it now. And with that in mind, like, I think having to handle someone else's grief at the same intensity as mine, I think might have been really hard. That said, obviously sharing the load would have been very helpful, particularly the bureaucratical stuff, like dealing with a will, dealing with probate. I never want to hear the word probate ever again in my life. You know, all that stuff is incredibly difficult, but also very indicative of why I decided to write it all down in a kind of guidebook process, because I remember again talking to one of my parents' friends who I was waxing lyrical about all these ridiculous words I've had to learn. And she was like, have you written this down anywhere for other people? Because like, I don't even know about this and I'm in my 50s. Like, it might be helpful. And it's true, like, particularly with my orphan WhatsApp group, like a lot of the time we're talking about, you know, I've got a group of 20-odd-year-olds who are all talking about selling property that wasn't theirs to start with, you know, and dealing with lawyers and solicitors, and it's ridiculous. And the thing that makes me so angry is that there's absolutely no guidance for this stuff until you're in the thick of it, which A, is difficult in the first place, but B, it's when you're emotionally screwed, like you have no idea what's going on. You have, I mean, I coined a lot of phrases in that book, but you have the grief fog, you have the grief anger, you have all these like extra levels of emotion, and you're also supposed to be doing like incredibly important stuff, either legally or just like kind of, what's the word, like ritualistically, like you're planning a funeral, you're planning a program, like what music they want to be buried to or whatever. Like it's a massive decision, and you've got no, like, you don't know about the timeline, you don't know how long you're supposed to wait between someone dying and registering the death and going to the funeral home and going to the wherever you're holding the funeral and then booking it, and then when you tell everyone, like it's a kind of 2-week madness that you learn the second it's happening.
Right. Yeah. Did you have any of your parents' friends? Were they helpful at all? Or
yeah, I was actually, again, yeah, lucky in that respect. My dad was married once before, and he was very close to his ex-wife, and I'm now really close to her as well, which is really lovely. And my mum's best friend was very, very helpful. So I kind of had like a touch point adult for each parent, which was really nice. Yeah, I mean, so much of the only childness with losing parents is just, it's just really difficult to think that, where did I see this phrase? This isn't my phrase, basically. But somebody said that you become the sole custodian of your entire family's memories.
Oh, you wrote that in your book.
Oh, was it my quote?
Oh, yeah.
I quoted myself. That's horrible. I'm so sorry. That is not the kind of
Yeah, but I remember thinking like, that's a really great line. I think I highlighted it. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so proud of myself, but also embarrassed. But yeah, it's a difficult. I think that was probably one of the hardest bits for me, was realizing that, and also made me write everything down with a fevered intensity, because all these in jokes, and all these little nicknames for each other, and all these behavioral quirks, and I mean, I'm living in my parents' house. This is my dad's study, but I know how he used to look when he was sitting at that desk and drinking tea. And if I don't write that down, I'm going to forget it because no one else is going to remind me, like losing that entire, and you're a family unit, like when it's three of you, it's obviously with any family, but particularly when it's just three, it's like mum, dad, kid scenario. It's, I don't know. It's very tough.
It is tough. And I think the fact that you've stayed in your parents' house, do you feel like that's helped you with because grief, it's not something like you're saying you get over within 8 months, a year, a few years. I imagine staying in your family home has given you that sort of time to really think about, like you said, those memories of your dad picking up in a certain position, because there could have been the temptation or the need to, like, I've got to sell the house and move on, and then you would have not had that time, if you like, to kind of think about the memory.
It's a pretty contested issue. I mean, within weeks of him dying, friends, maybe not friends, people around me were doing a lot of, oh, so you'll sell, oh, so you'll rent it, oh, so you're going to leave. And it was quite abrasive, because it was very, very quick after, but also there's this, I don't know if it's societal expectation that you shouldn't kind of remain in a limbo state, as it were. And it's not even a limbo state, purely from like a logical standpoint. Like, the house is owned, so I don't have to pay rent on it. I'm just paying for utilities and stuff. Like in London, that's a pretty sweet deal. But also, I didn't have anywhere else I wanted to be. I guess the kind of the pertinent information would be that my dad was dying for about just under a year. And I was living in another flat with a friend, and she was moving out to go traveling, and I would have probably moved somewhere else, but at the time, the stars aligned and I moved back here to look after him. So I didn't actually have somewhere else that I was living. And obviously that year of grief after he died was decimating. And if I'd had to handle looking for somewhere else to live, deciding where else to live, and then I have a fair amount of like house anxiety, security wise, like the place falling down, all that kind of very off the wall thinking, but still I would have still had to maintain this place and look after it from afar. And it kind of made sense for me to stay here. Plus I'm quite obstinate, and I think there was an angle of it'd be too much to live there by yourself kind of thing, so I was like, screw you, of course I can. But also particularly through all of, oh sorry, go on.
No, I think it's a really great thing that you stayed there. I think it would have, from reading your book, I think it would have been a real even more sadness to have moved on, particularly being an only child. And you've really taken the time to like honor your parents' belongings and thinking about them. And I think I just feel that it's a really important part of your process. And and I was thinking about the book. You've put on the cover how I learned to grieve the loss of my parents. And we do need to learn to grieve. And the people around you that were like, okay, chop chop, move on, sell the house, that wouldn't have taught you a lot. I don't think.
That's a really, I hadn't, I love when people say it back, like I wouldn't have kind of registered the importance in that phrase. But I think it is a massive learning curve, and it's something I've had the luxury of time with. I've been able to allow myself the space, and it's been, I would never say the pandemic has been a positive thing. But for me, in terms of pacing out my handling of this situation that I was found myself in, it's been really amazing, because I've got to know my house on a whole nother level.
Yeah.
And I've had so many stages where I've gone into cupboards and been like, oh, I don't actually need to keep a dozen pairs of my mum's flip-flops when she died 11 years ago. I could get rid of those now. It's a magical time to have so much decluttering. But it's something that I knew was happening over the decade between my parents' deaths. I understood that as time went on, things that I gave great importance to suddenly had less importance until suddenly they could just go and I wouldn't mind. And I know that's not the same for everyone, but for me, that's how it's always been. Yeah. And I'm pretty au fait with this whole process now. So I do understand my own levels. And that's been really lovely to be able to walk around and actually think, yeah, no, I could totally change things in here, and I could totally get rid of that. I'll be fine. And I have actually, in the last maybe 6 months or so, felt much more okay about selling this house if and when I want to, and not being here. And 5 years ago, that would have really scared me, and I wouldn't have wanted to, and I would have said no. So I know it's not the opportunity for everybody. Like a lot of people do have to sell the properties for paying off inheritance tax and all that crazy stuff. But I don't think it's a bad thing to stay in the same place.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I thought it was also being an only child, it just felt like that's part of your family, that house, like your foundations and your roots, and really important for you. Going back a little bit to the sort of learn to grieve question, I was wondering how you would sort of interpret conscious grief.
I think I wasn't doing conscious grief I wasn't consciously grieving for probably most of the time between my parents' deaths. And I always liken it to whack-a-mole. It felt like a whack-a-mole situation where because I was so not even unprepared, but just ignorant of dealing with it. I didn't want to deal with it. That it was just popping up at really random, inopportune moments. And I think over the last, Dad died in end of 2017. I think since then, what I have been doing is learning how to consciously grieve, which is, the phrase holding space does get overused quite a bit at the moment, but holding space for it, registering as and when I feel, I've been very aware of my own emotional landscape and the way that it moves. And I can tell, I've got particular personal triggers that I know I'm starting to go on a dip. And instead of just kind of completely ignoring it and trying to battle through, which I am prone to do, actually just taking the time out and saying, okay, so what is it that's happening, and what are you facing off with, and trying to ignore. And again, this might be very, unique to me, but I talk to my parents a lot. I talk to them out loud. Like, being in this house probably is a great precipitator for that. But I feel like that just kind of, it elevates grief from being like a heavy weighted, painful, thing in your gut, to a kind of much higher floaty situation. And it feels a lot easier to manage, and it feels a lot kinder, really. I don't think grief is necessarily a hugely negative thing. But if you ignore it for a long time, or you just refuse to let it do what it needs to do, because it does need to happen, then it just becomes this really scary, malevolent, cloudy, dark, rainstormy thing. And I think a lot of people are very, very scared of grief, because the word is just, it's so heavy. It's got so much to it, and it doesn't have to necessarily be, I think grief for me now is, I'm 3 years on from my dad's death, I think. 3 years. Yeah. 2010 doesn't really count anymore, does it? But yeah, I think about 3 years on from him, and if I think to what I was like 3 years after Mum's death, like, completely different, because I really hadn't processed anything. And I'm really proud of the fact that I kind of almost aggressively processed. Yeah.
Like you're saying, the more conscious you become about your emotional landscape, the more, the whack-a-mole I totally relate to, because I was having these, I call them grief bursts, and where I would just start crying uncontrollably, and I didn't have no idea that it was grief, and I'd have to leave work and say, I'm so sorry, I have to go, because I just couldn't stop crying. And I would just always be blaming something else in my life.
Really?
I'd always think it was the boyfriend. Even though there was no, although there was no real link, but I just, I never ever was relating it back to the fact that I had these huge traumas in my life, so I'd always be like, I'm fine, I'm functioning, I'm doing. So I just felt that I was really walking around very unconsciously for a long, long time. Yeah.
But I think it's so easy to do that again, like, unless there's some kind of roadmap that you can look at, even briefly. I think it's difficult, because if you refuse to see it.
I was going to say, I think if someone put the roadmap in front of me, I wouldn't have been interested in looking at it. Because again, I'm a bit obstinate too. I'm like, I'll do it my way, thanks. I'll learn the hard way. I'll go the long route as opposed to the short.
Yeah, often happens.
Lost, yeah. And last question, we know we're running out of time. I was wondering if there have been any gifts in your grief.
I mean, yeah, I have. I don't think I could have anticipated that the kind of the biggest and most fulfilling thing I'd be doing would be writing intensely personally about the fact that I went through something hellish. But it's honestly gifted me a hell of a lot. Like, I had a difficult but lovely message from someone, because I get the reason I wrote this book in the first place was I wrote this blog article about losing your parents before you turn 30, and it completely inadvertently became incredibly popular, and I get a lot of messages. I published it about 3 years ago, and I still get messages all the time. So it's like a really good lead in for people finding my stuff. But I had a message from somebody who'd read that article and said that they were actually really jealous of me, because the fact that I wrote about this grief and clearly had a lot of people talking to me about theirs meant that I'd just kind of inadvertently made a community out of it, and that I must not feel so alone, and that this person felt really alone and didn't know anyone who'd been through the same thing and stuff. And it completely shifted my whole perspective of what I have been doing, because I didn't intend to have loads and loads of people messaging me about their really difficult times, but it is incredibly affirming to realize that at any moment that you're dealing with this particular scenario, particular unique as far as you think, grief situation, there's probably about 300, 400, 500 people other around the world dealing with exactly the same thing. Like, I've met people online who've had the same ages that they were when their parents died, the same order of parents dying, the same illnesses, and that does create this bond. And yeah, I just have this amazing realization of just all these people spiderwebbed all over the world who are all dealing with this awful thing, but all finding each other as a result and being able to talk about the really hard stuff. And I think that's really important. Like, surface level conversation often doesn't really interest me, because I really want to get into the good stuff, because it's it's incredibly life affirming to realize that all these people had these people who they loved, and they still really want to talk about them, and they really miss them, but that's kind of okay, because at least they had them in the first place. And yeah, it's
brought a big community, and that's what makes us feel good, isn't it? It makes us feel connected, and it brings the connection, the joy, and the happiness, and that's out of something that's really sad. But yeah, and like, you have I always say, a deeper, richer experience of life that it's not all about the surface level stuff. And maybe this past year in the pandemic has really pushed us all to be less surface level, because we haven't had to go out and be, wearing the latest whatever, or sort of showing off our travel things or whatever. It's made us all be a little bit more like, oh, life's tough out there, and let's talk about, rather than just always being like, everything's great, everything's fine. People are actually really talking about their deeper inner internal worlds.
Completely. I think it's going to have made, well, I think I can see the evidence already that people are just being a lot more transparent about how they actually are. And particularly for, someone who writes about their personal life or their personal feelings even, it's a long time coming, and it's lovely to see. It's obviously scary because I think people are very dubious about being that honest, I think, whether online or off, but I think it's necessary. I think people should be
definitely
feeling comfortable to do that, because it's how, as you said, it's how we create connections with people, and it's how we feel less alone. And that's pretty much the biggest part of the whole grief journey is this horrible, again, going like circling way back to the start, like how unique grief is, that it just has this ability to make you feel so isolated when you're really not.
Yeah.
But the feeling of it happening seems so unique and so only about you and your life and your loss. But it's mirrored in so many millions of other people's experiences. Like, we've all had variations on a theme of how painful this can be. And every time I talk to someone new about it, and you find all these things that are similar, and you're like, see, grief is the same. It's, yeah.
I know, and the internet really is amazing for making us, a lot of people, you can argue that it's making us more isolated in one sense, but in another sense, it really does connect us. And reading about people's, difficult experiences, and knowing that you're not the only person, because maybe it's too difficult to even talk about sometimes, that reading something or listening to something like this, it helps a lot until you've got the courage to reach out and ask somebody to talk about it. Yeah,
I think that's really, it's a very valuable part of all this. Like, I've definitely had people tell me that since reading that book, they've been able to show chapters to people in their lives, particularly because, I was quite proud of this when I wrote a chapter about like what to say what to say to someone else someone who's grieving in your life, how to help a griever, that's what it's called. But I think it's just really valuable, because I've had people say, like, I couldn't really explain to my boyfriend why I found it so difficult to be around him sometimes when I was grieving, and he read this chapter and it makes more sense to him now. And because it's a very delicate situation, having all this emotion going on, but having no vocabulary to talk about it. And as you said, like, being able to read about someone else's, you're like, oh, that's how I feel, but I didn't know that that's what the words for it were, but someone else has written them. That's good.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Flora, I am so pleased that you wrote this book. It's such an amazing resource, truly. And I want to tell the people who are listening or watching that you must go to Flora's website, Flora the Explorer, and we'll have a link below this video. And she will be doing a competition. So if you enter the competition by putting your email address into her, is there a box to sign up? Subscription box. So sign up to that and you'll have the chance to win. And like I say, this really is a book that you don't even have to be an orphan right now. It's like if your parents are getting older, or you're afraid of death, or you want to help even how to talk to somebody who's had somebody close to them die. It's just a really great resource to have in your bookshelf. So I highly recommend you go and buy it or enter the competition. So anything else before we wrap up, Flora?
No, it's been so lovely to chat to you about this. I could honestly talk about grief all day.
I know. I was thinking like, oh my gosh, we've gone really over time, but we're going to talk again soon, so it's fine. Yeah, we have lots more to talk about. Okay. Thank you again, and I'll see you soon.